Welcome to friends and colleagues, to those here in York and to those joining us online to the second annual York and the North lecture delivered by Dr. Andrew Woods, Head of Collections and Research at York Museum Trust. My name is Kenneth Clark. I'm the Director of the Centre for Medieval Studies, which has the honour to host this lecture series. Sitting at the intersection of recent research, heritage and public engagement, the York and the North lecture series aims to draw together academic, heritage sector and public audiences to learn about and explore the history of York and Northern England. The idea of North feels especially poignant this year of 2025, the 50th anniversary of the publication of Seamus Heaney's collection, North, where in the title poem, the poet speaks of those fabulous raiders, those lying in Orkney and Dublin, measured against their long swords rusting, those in the solid belly of stone ships, those hacked and glinting in the gravel of thawed streams, were ocean-deafened voices warning me, lifted again in violence and epiphany. Tonight, we take stock, as Heaney did 50 years ago, of the North and its long cultural traditions of the Viking past. I now have the great pleasure of passing you to my colleague, Dr. Steve Ashby, the Chair of the Board of Studies in the Centre for Medieval Studies, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andy Woods, Head of Collections and Research at York Museums Trust, who's going to be giving tonight's lecture. We're delighted to have Andy here, as he really kind of personifies a lot of the ideals I think we have at the CMS. It brings together sort of scholarly rigor and ingenuity in research with a commitment to public engagement, all of which is framed in a very interdisciplinary manner. It's going a bit red now. And Andy and I go back a little way. We actually share a PhD supervisor. We've grown up academically as next door neighbours, more or less. I'm not sure if that means anything. Andy has degrees in history from the University of Bristol and St Andrews. He has a PhD from Cambridge on the topic of money and economy in Viking Age Ireland, late Viking Age Ireland, a subject that many of us still really associate him with. And I think what distinguishes a lot of Andy's work is that kind of rigorous approach to coinage that moves beyond pure numismatics and is very much archaeological, engaging with important questions about exchange and economy, but also about identity and politics. So after completing his PhD, Andy worked with the Portable Antiquities Scheme and with the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and he came to York in 2013 as curator of numismatics at York Museums Trust. And I very clearly remember hearing that news, being not only excited that we were getting someone to look after this kind of exciting collection of coins we knew was next door, but also that it was someone who we knew who did very good, very exciting things with Viking coins. Since then, he's not sat very still, though. He's been successively senior curator for the Yorkshire Museum and now head of collections and research for YMT. And under his curatorship, the museum's collections have expanded through a number of really kind of notable donations and acquisitions, things like the Wold Newton, the Overton hoards, the famous gold Trimser. And Andy's research has tended to use coins and other forms of artifacts as a way of sort of mapping economic and political networks, dynamics, that sort of thing. And over the 12 years he's been here at the Trust, he's undertaken a lot of research into the coinage and the hoards of York and the North. He's recently been involved in a large project called Landscape and Lordship, where he's been looking at 6th to 8th century England, and particularly the very famous elite site of Rendlesham in Suffolk. Most recently of all, of course, he's overseen the development and the installation of the Yorkshire Museum's new Viking North exhibit. And that draws very heavily, I think, on recent research by archaeologists, some of whom are in the room today, as well as on work of metal detectorists in the region, and on new analyses of material held by the museum and that's been held for some time. And bringing all that together, it really does provide a new perspective on that story of the Viking Age in the north of England. And I really strongly recommend you to go and see it if you haven't already. And so with that, we come to tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Andy Woods and his talk on coinage, silver and power in York and the Viking North.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Kenneth, for the very warm introduction, and good evening. I like that you're my academic big brother. We share a kind of PhD supervisor. I'm going to take that with me, Steve. So, good evening. This evening, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our new exhibition, Viking North, some of the research that underpinned it, and then how that has influenced and sort of challenged. Okay. Challenged me to think a little bit afresh about some of the coinages of the 9th and 10th centuries. This is particularly well timed. We've just opened our exhibition, Viking North. You can see the poster here, and you can see the actual objects on display in the Yorkshire Museum. And it seeks to tell the story of York and the North in the Viking Age, and so it couldn't be more appropriate in some ways. The exhibition aimed... There we go. The exhibition brings together the Yorkshire Museum's nationally significant archaeological collections with a range of loans from regional partners and private lenders, and as a whole suite of objects that have never been on public display before. I think this is probably the biggest and best group of Viking Age objects anywhere in England at present, although I would say that. And you can see some of them on the screen here. The inspiration behind that exhibition, as Steve noted, is really at the heart of any exhibition, any great exhibition, is new research. We don't want to be telling the same stories to our audiences that we've told before. And the reason why we're doing this exhibition now is because a whole host of new research, and some of the major pieces that inspired that exhibition are on screen here, by scholars such as Gareth Williams, Julian Richards, Dawn Hadley, Jane Kershaw, and then Tom Horn and Lucy Moore as well, have sort of inspired some different thinking about the Viking Age, and that's what we try to tell within the exhibition. And as Steve noticed, much of this research has been underpinned by the brilliant work of the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which identifies and records finds made by members of the public, particularly metal detectorists. And I think it'd be fair to say that they've revolutionized the collections of the Yorkshire Museum, and with that, alongside that, the research that I'll talk about in a moment. And two strands of work have particularly influenced the exhibition. The first of that strand has focused upon the early Viking Age, the 9th century in particular, and the phenomenon often known as the Great Army. For a long time, this was a historical phenomenon, known from references like you see here on the left from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. But the form and scale of that army was conditioned almost entirely by those historical sources. We don't really get a sense of kind of what it was like, other than being able to draw this sort of Dad's Army arrows on a map. We have a blow-by-blow of where they were, but little sense of the scale or activities of that army. Work by Gareth Williams at Old Walk and Dawn Hadley and Julian Richards at Torksey, Old Walk and a range of other sites has assembled and analysed thousands of objects found by metal detectorists from these Viking camps. And you just see a sample of some of them on the screen here. And we're really lucky to be able to bring together a few hundred objects from Old Walk as part of the exhibition. In bringing these together, they've been able to connect the fragmentary objects left behind by that great army to a range of activity and have built a picture of life in the Viking Great Army available in your local bookstores. That picture of the Great Army suggests that thinking of it purely as an army is hugely reductive. It's a place of men, women, children, of mixed people from Scandinavia, Francia, England and Ireland, of varied foodstuffs and provisioning strategies, of craft and production, gaming and gambling. And for the purpose of my talk today, where I'm going to focus particularly on coinage and silver, they've shown that these camps functioned almost like little towns in some ways, with varied ways of doing business. They've shown that the metal weight mentality came from, Scandinavia, with silver cut into hack silver and weighed out on balances, and seen in the fragments of gold, silver and copper on the screen here. They've shown that coins were used whole, in some cases, counted out, like the little one you see on the top left here, with varied kingdoms, coinage of Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, all circulating alongside one another inside these camps. They showed that material of exchange was also turned into items for display, for jewellery and the like. And they've also shown that within these camps, it's something that's quite distinct, both from Scandinavia and also what was in England before. It is genuinely a phenomenon that isn't directly paralleled in either. The second piece of research is that by Dr. Jane Kershaw, who, working alongside Stephen Merkel, has destructively sampled and analysed the silver using lead isotopes as well as elemental analysis from the Bedale hoard that you see on the screen here. And this is a hoard that was buried in the late 9th century, probably in the 880s or 890s, a generation or so after the division of England between Scandinavian rulers from the Great Army and their English counterparts. The hoard is on display in the exhibition, and it's composed of a range of decorative objects, this giant neck ring that you see here on the left, arm rings at the front of at the bottom of this image, and then a whole suite of ingots, which are the sort of cigar-shaped objects at the back. There's a real mixture of silver for display and silver for economic purposes here, although sadly for my purpose, no coins. An analysis of that hoard has identified that some of the silver had been refined with lead to purify it, to raise the silver level within it. So 14 objects were refined and through a process called cupellation. Of the 21 objects that weren't refined, we can trace the origins of that silver. And amongst those 21 objects, 9 of them, 9 ingots, were made with silver that had been mined in the Islamic world, in modern-day Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. 3 were definitively Western European in their origins, probably from France, and 9 were a mix of European and Eastern silver. The fact that a very significant proportion of the silver in this hoard had ultimately come from another continent, the Islamic world, from those mines in the Asian subcontinent, is both in some ways incredible and in other ways expected. I think it's incredible because it turns our assumptions about the early Viking Age on its head. We tend to think of the Viking Age as extractive. Scandinavians come to Britain and take wealth away. What this analysis has shown is the opposite. They bring significant wealth with them, and that wealth is ultimately coming from the Near East. In other ways, we should expect this. We've known for quite some time that lots of Islamic silver has flowed into Europe in the Viking Age, and this is just a map of all of the fine spots of hoards that contain Islamic coins. But what Jane's research has shown is that made its way to Britain earlier than previously imagined. It's definitely a 9th century phenomenon, not one that only happens in the 10th. And it's here earlier and in far larger volumes than we'd ever anticipated before. So those are the 2 pieces of research were some of the reasons why we're doing this exhibition now. And they're also the point where I'd like to take as my jumping off point for today. These 2 new pieces of evidence challenge us to look afresh at our own areas of research interests, and that's what I'm going to do for the rest of today. I'm a numismatist, a coin specialist, and I'm going to go back to the evidence of coinage in this period with some fresh questions in mind. And given this is the York and the North lecture, I'm going to particularly focus upon the relationship between York and the rest of the North for today. I'm going to seek to answer the 3 questions you see on the screen here, which is, can we trace that influx of Islamic silver in the money of the Viking North? Was money used in similar ways within York and then more broadly across the North? And what the area of my particular interest, I suppose, is what are the role of elites in shaping how money was used within York and across the North? In terms of my approach, I'm just going to do a very little bit of background so that we're all on the same page about where Viking Age Northumbria is. Start with production, looking at how coinage was made within the town of York. Then look at how it was used within the townscape of York, and then broaden that out to consider the whole of the North. In terms of time period, I'm going to consider the period between about 820 and 950. 820 is before the Great Army arrives in York, and it's kind of useful context and background, and it provides a useful comparison to what happens thereafter. And then I'm going to finish at about 950-ish, which is with the death of Eric Bloodaxe, often seen as the end of Scandinavian control in York. I'm particularly going to focus on the late 9th century, but the kind of shoulders of that on either side are useful to give a broader sense of things. So then, background, a little bit about Northumbria, the Kingdom of the North, really. I've put this map up, not because I like it, but because I can't find one that I actually do like, and this is at least one that no one in this room has made, and so I kind of found anyone. Northumbria the area north of the Humber is a kind of reasonable way of thinking about it. Easier to define its eastern border of the sea and the southern border with the Humber than it is its west and its north. So exactly how far north and how far west it extends, if you could tell me, that would be fantastic. It sort of was traditionally divided between Deir and Bernicia. Deir is the kind of economic heart of that kingdom, I would argue, in the south, with York at its centre, but more evidence for the kind of expression of political power further to the north at sites like Bamborough and the like. York in this period was a centre of production, craft, exchange, and learning. And before the Viking Age, it was, and during the Viking Age, it was absolutely the centre of faith as well. It has an archbishop throughout, and that archbishop had a really important role to play. And this is a coin struck by one of those archbishops, Archbishop Wigmund, in the early part of the 9th century. And you're a powerful political actor if you can have coinage struck in your own name. And so absolutely a really central role for the church in pre-Viking York. The historical sources are patchy, I think, and they give a sense of Northumbria in the pre-Viking Age, which is, in the 9th century, one of political conflict and slight uncertainty and instability, perhaps, but without absolute precision on even the chronology or order of all of the kings who ruled. So good, but not great, I suppose. And then in terms of the chronology that I'm going to be talking about today, I'm not proposing to talk you through the entirety of this slide, but the Great Army that talked about before arrives in York in 866 and then returns again probably in 874 after that army divides, with some coming north. And that there is Scandinavian rule in York from the 870s onwards through until 927, when Athelstan, Southern English king, conquers York and indeed most of the north. Thereafter, York passes, and probably more broadly southern part of Northumbria, passes between English rule from the south and Scandinavian rule, with the Scandinavian kings often retreating to Dublin when they're not in charge of York. And it's sort of this interesting contested control for a couple of generations. And most of my analysis today is going to try and draw a broad distinction either side of about 870, i.e. the bit before the Great Army and the bit afterwards. But this is just a useful bit of context. I'm going to assume that most of you have never actually really looked at these coins before, which is reasonable. And so just to give you a sense of what they look like, coins from about 820 to 870, often called stikers. I'm not going to use that term because it's made up, but I'm going to call them copper alloy coins today. They're very small things, about 1 centimeter in diameter. They look like the image in the top right here. They're not elaborately decorated. They just have the name of the king or the archbishop on one side and the money on the other, often with a cross or a pellet or so. Like between 870 and 895, there's a gap in production. There are no coins struck in York or across the north. From the 890s onwards, they're struck in silver. They're much larger things, about twice the size and diameter, in fine silver, and that gives chance for kind of beautiful iconography on these coins, like the coin you see in the middle here with its cross with crosses on the arms, and also much larger legends. And they're mostly struck in kings' names, but there are also some that are anonymous, might just say York or something on it. And then from 927 through to 954, they continue to be issued in silver, but are struck for both Scandinavian and Southern English kings. Scandinavians in these distinctive styles, like the bird, raven, eagle, depending on your interpretation of it here, whereas Southern English coins conform to the patterns of Mercia and Wessex further to the south. So if that's a little bit of background, then what I would like to talk to you first about is production. Throughout this period, York is the only mint in northern England. It is the only place in Northumbria which is striking coinage. And I describe a mint. We don't really know how it works in the 9th or 10th century. No one writes down mint practice, but the image that you see on the right-hand side of this slide is an early modern woodcut, and it sort of gives a sense of the types of processes that go on within a mint. So you have a figure in the center who's sort of hammering the discs of silver out to create the coins. Someone on the left with their gigantic snips, cutting them down to the appropriate size and weight. And then the fellow on the right with the hammer, he's wielding a hammer and striking a coin die. All of the coins of this period are hammered. You set the lower die into a piece of wood, hold the upper in your hand, hit them with a hammer, and that creates the impression on your soft piece of silver within. The fellow at the back is probably the monetarius, the moneyer, and he's responsible for the process. He's weighing out the silver on his balance at the back and then exchanging it with the customer who needs these coins to go and spend in the market. We're quite lucky in York in that we have surviving dies. The evidence for this process archaeologically is almost non-existent, except they found 2 dies at Coppergate. So that's the image on the left here. The one on the left with its sort of projecting shank at the bottom, that would have been fixed into a piece of wood or an anvil. And then the other piece is a cap that probably went on the upper die and was hammered. Both are damaged, which is why they've survived archaeologically. They would have been destroyed because you don't want them to fall into the wrong hands. But yeah, so we do have some evidence for this, and it suggests to me that coinage was being struck at Coppergate, where the York Viking Centre is. But one of the joys for us in early medieval coinage is that all of these dies are hand engraved. So no 2 tools for the making of coinage are exactly the same. They're ever so slightly different. And it means that numismatists like myself can spend a very long time looking at coins to find what we call die links, 2 coins made with the same tool. And that's what is on the screen here. These are 2 different coins made with exactly the same tool. And you can see it, there's 2 little kind of crosses in the top left corner. If you look at the alignment of those on the 2 coins, you'll see that they are the same. So this is 2 coins that circulated separately, but were made from the same set of dies. What we can do is if we count the number of coins we have and we count all the look at how many dies are made within that, then we can begin to estimate how many tools were used through time, and in turn begin to estimate production. How does that go up or down as we go through time? To do that, you count the number of coins you have, the number of dies that those coins represent, how often there are links within your set, and then you do a quite complicated set of statistics over the top of that to get a sense of how many dies were originally created. And don't worry too much about the methodology. All it's safe to say is that York's coinage is one of the best studied early medieval coinage. We have complete die studies for everything through to 870 and for almost everything from 890 through to 950. It means I haven't had to go and look at all of this. Someone's done all this hard work for me already. And so what I'm going to do is show you some of those estimates of production through time on the basis of data from Elizabeth Peary and Megan Gooch. If we plot this on a graph, this is what we get. And it's quite a complicated looking graph, so just let me talk you through it. And this is a bar chart representing the number of dies used per year. So the number of those tools that were striking coins on an annual basis. Across the bottom of this is our time frame, made 10 on the left through to about 950. And the dating here is based on the chronology of production, is largely based upon the name of the issuer of those coins. So we know Red Wolf reigned in the mid-840s, and so we can put his coinage at that moment in time. The big gap in the middle between 870 and 890 is because no coins were being struck there, genuine gap. The gap on the right-hand side of this is where we don't have any surviving data. The data isn't good enough to be able to plot it. The yellow bit is the copper alloy coins that were struck before the Vikings arrive in York, and the kind of grey bit on the right is the change to silver that follows it thereafter. This methodology is likely to flatten out peaks and troughs quite a lot. There's nothing I can do about that, in that if you can kind of imagine it, it's unlikely there's a kind of steady production all of the time. But if you can imagine a market happens in spring, that's when you're going to strike large amounts of coinage. But we don't have the chronological precision to be more precise than that. So what does it actually tell us? Well, it tells us that the kind of the bottom end of our production here is around 10 dies per annum. And that is a substantial number of tools used in any one year. That would compare to mint almost anywhere else across the country. And it would rank York right towards the top of that kind of, there's not a league table of minting, but if there was, we'd do okay. And I'm just going to focus in on 2 things in particular, which are the 2 areas I've highlighted here, the kind of peaks and troughs here. The first is in the 840s. Within this decade, there's the 8-year rule of Ethelred II with a kind of 1-year hiatus where Red Wolf reigns. Across that decade, over 300 dies were used to strike the coins, producing this pretty high figure of more than 50 per annum. Now, why so many? Don't have an absolute answer to this, but this is a period of kind of contested royal power, and it might be these 2 kings are trying to almost remint the other's coinage as a kind of political statement to legitimize their rule. That's the best theory I have at the moment. perhaps more important for today is the kind of bit on the right here, which is the decade around 900 AD. And this is the first of the coinages struck for the Scandinavian rulers in York, issued in the name of Canute and Seaforth. And this is the largest Anglo-Scandinavian coinage in terms of the number of dies, with an estimate of more than 400 used in the decade to create it. 400 tools used to create these. Now, that's all slightly esoteric numbers, and I slightly hesitate to show you this slide because we begin to get into the realms of compound errors here. But there are many assumptions to be made here. The first is we can try and turn some of this into actual numbers. So die estimates come with confidence intervals. When we run a bit of statistics through it, you end up with some ranges. Going from the number of tools used to the number of coins they could strike is hard work. No one tells us that this die made 8,000 coins and this one made 15,000, but we have later medieval evidence that says dies averaged about 10,000 coins before they wore themselves out. I've taken a much more conservative estimate of 5,000 coins to produce the figures you see in the middle of this graph. And that is an assumption. It's a best guess rather than anything else. I've then added an estimate of how much raw material was needed to strike the entirety of these coinages. And that's based on the median weight of those coins. And that gets us to the 1,500 to 1,700 kilograms of copper alloy needed to strike those spiky coinages, or the 2,500 to 3,000 kilograms of silver. And we have to be cautious with those numbers. They could be wrong easily by 50% in either direction, and that would be absolutely fine within the methodology. I think it's probably more appropriate to think of them as a really big number as opposed to exactly 2,000 kilograms. With those kind of cautions in mind, what I will say is that we can take a few things from this. The first is that there is a really substantial copper coinage struck in York in particularly in the 840s, but in the decades either side of that. And it continued to circulate into the 850s and 860s. This is a scale really unparalleled anywhere else in contemporary England, where coins were struck in much smaller quantities in poor quality silver. This really was a mass coinage. Perhaps more importantly for today, in the year around 900, there was a colossal coinage struck here in York. Hundreds of dies, likely striking millions of coins, which don't really show up in our finds record. And I'll explain why I think that is the case in a little while. But the raw material to create coinage of this type had to come from somewhere. Hundreds, thousands of kilos of silver would have been required. That is, the top end of this is about 3 tons of silver. The largest Viking Age hoard from England, found at Bedale in Lancashire, is around 40 kilograms. So to make York's coinage of this sort of scale, you need 80 Bedale hoards, which is, if you've ever seen it laid out, it fills a huge case in the British Museum, and that's only a portion of it. It is a colossal amount of silver. So where does it all come from? There's a few different possibilities. The first is that it was already present here. The second is that it might come from French mines, and the third is from the Islamic world. And the first thing to note is that similar phenomena are happening in Mercia and Wessex, further south in England, where all of a sudden, in the 880s in particular, good quality silver coins pop up in very large numbers. They almost appear out of nowhere in each of these 3 kingdoms independently, but in very similar chronology. The first kind of suggestion is it was already here. And the usual explanation is that when you get a large number of coins made, it's the melting down of all the old currency to turn it into something new. But this is really unlikely to my mind. The huge number of Northumbrian coins that we can see before the arrival of the Vikings were struck in copper alloy. They don't provide the raw materials for a large silver coin. And they really had no silver in them since at least 820. It's just not a lot of silver in Northumbria's coinage. I think it's also likely to not come from Mercia or Wessex. Coins of Burgred, like the type you see here on the left, Ethelbert in the center, are struck from silver that's about 30% fine. They're really quite debased silver. And the impression really that you get of England in the 850s, 860s, and 870s is there just isn't much silver around to turn into coinage. And so it's not that it is there ready to be turned into something else a decade or 2 later. You could make an argument that it might have been silver in other forms like this. So these are some beautiful silver strap ends from Poppleton. I foolishly cut the scale off, but they're about 8 or 9 centimeters in length. So each one would probably have made 30 coins or so if you melted it down. They're beautifully decorated with sort of Trewiddle-style animals and then yellow inlays as a set. And you might be able to say that there's lots of silver in the form of decorative objects rather than coins, maybe silver held within churches that could be melted down and turned into coinage. However, I do find it hard to imagine that there is enough silver already in Northumbria to mobilize to create an entirely new coinage on this sort of scale. The traditional explanation is that there was an exploitation of mines in France, specifically a place called Mel on a large scale. And this is a coin from Mel with a Carolingian legend on it, so Carolus Rex, king of the Franks, and then Metullo, so Mel on the reverse. However, recent work on the isotopes of the silver in the mines and the silver in the coins suggests that it isn't exploited in the late 9th century or anything like the scale it would need to be to underpin coinages and across the whole of England. There is some exploitation of the silver in that mine, but not on the kind of industrial scales we're talking about here. And that takes us back to the analysis of Bedale as a potential source for this upsurge. The chronology works here. The Bedale hoard was likely buried a few years before the minting of all of the coins that I've just identified. And I think it fairly likely that the massive upsurge in coinage created in York around AD 900 and the other kingdoms of England in the period just before that was at least partially underpinned by a flood of silver from the Near East in the last decades of the 9th century. I wouldn't say that there is no impact of those French mines. There's definitely some of that, but the overwhelming chemical signature within the Bedale hoard suggests it's an Islamic source, is the majority of that, rather than something closer to home. So then, to try and draw that first piece to close, then just a summary of production. The first is we can use the number of dies known to give a sense of the scale of production. And that before the Viking Great Army arrives in York, very large numbers of coins were made, particularly in the 840s. Hundreds of dies, making millions of coins using tons of copper alloy. There's a major peak in silver production around the year 900 of a similar scale, but with a completely different raw material. That silver was likely to come from outside of the Kingdom of Northumbria and in all likelihood from the Near East via Scandinavia. This is on a major scale and a far earlier date than we might have previously thought. And it was on a scale that's sufficient to underpin a transformation of the means of exchange from one that was predominantly copper to one that was silver. So then, turning to York, there are nearly 200 coin finds from York, and these are excavated and chance finds. Most of them come from excavations over the last 30 or 40 years, with a few chance finds from a little bit older than that, going back to the 19th century. There are very few that are in what we call primary contexts. So we can't look at them versus the stratigraphy. They're mostly residual, turning up in layers elsewhere, higher up in our chronology. And so I'm going to look at them today at a city level rather than look at them individually within the excavations they came from. So this is a figure that shows when those coins were being used in York. It plots coin finds by the decade in which they were produced, with time across the bottom, 810 to 950 again. And I would stress that this is the date of their production, not their date of use. A whole load of coins might have been made in 830 and continued to circulate through to 860. We don't know when they were used and lost, only when they were made. And we can draw a few things from this. The first is that coinage was pretty widespread, well, incredibly widespread in York between the 820s and 860s. That big production spike that I was able to identify earlier shows up in the coin finds in the 840s in particular as well. It wasn't just coinage being made in large numbers, but also being used in large numbers. But we can't say the same for the later coinages, the right-hand side of the graph that you're looking at. The big spike in production I've just spent 10 minutes talking about doesn't show up in the coin finds in the same way. I'll explain why in a moment. This is a plot of where they are coming from. So underlying this is the Historic Towns Atlas for York. I haven't got a pointer, but the kind of big blob at the top is York Minster, and a bit at the bottom is Fishergate, and the railway stations on the left-hand side of this. And plotted on this map are some red circles, and the bigger the red circle is the more coins have been found in that excavation, and the little blue squares represent hoards, deliberate deposition of tens, hundreds, or thousands of coins. There are a number of hotspots on this. The biggest single site for coin finds of the 9th century is Fishergate, right down at the bottom of this. Fishergate is really seen as a site of the 8th century Wick, a trading site, and doesn't have a 9th century history. The coin finds would suggest otherwise, and would suggest that there continues to be an important riverine exchange going on at the confluence of the two rivers there. And similarly, we have quite a significant riverine distribution at the kind of top left of this, Queen's Hotel, close to a modern-day Lendal Bridge, which again would suggest kind of riverine exchange being a big driver of this. But that's not the only places you see it. There's a big concentration in Coppergate as well, and immediately around the Minster. And I think it's unlikely that the coinage is being used in the same ways in all of those spaces. I can see something quite different occurring in the Minster, where you could see almsgiving underlying as a reason for the use and loss of coinage there in a way that it might be more commercial exchange in a riverine space. There's also a curious concentration of 5 hoards in the top left here in the area around the museum gardens and just inside the walls there. These are some massive hoards, thousands of coins, and there's a kind of suggestion this might be a centre of secular power in York, which works for me. I guess the particular thing to maybe more important is the really thin distribution of a whole range of sites right across the townscape. They're not concentrated in one area, but almost everywhere where you find Anglo-Saxon activity, you also find some of these coins. Not in large numbers, 1 or 2 here and there, but they are right across the town, suggesting to me a wide variety of transactions, not restricted to a single place or a single type of person. If that's where they were used, then we can also look at where they were made. This is the same graph I showed you earlier, but this time with the blue bit representing coins that were made in York and the orange bit representing coins that were made elsewhere, at mints, maybe in Wessex, Mercia, or Francia. From this, we can say that between 810 and 850, there are very few coins that are used in York that weren't also made here. And what I would argue that you're seeing there is that there is an effective exclusion of non-local currency. If you want to spend money in York, you need to do it using the official currency of the Kingdom of Northumbria. The advantage to a ruler in enforcing that type of thing is that if you can make them use the coinage with your name on it, then you can tax it as well. It becomes an important source of wealth for both king and archbishop in the 9th century. That certainly seems to be the case in pre-Viking Northumbria. And I'm just going to look in a little bit more detail at the sort of flat bit at the right-hand side of this. If we remove the 840 spike, we can see patterns a little bit more clearly. Before 850, there was very clear control, very few coins not struck in York. And then from 850 and 860, there's all of a sudden you have these kind of orange blobs sitting on the top of those. And all of a sudden there are coins that were not made in Northumbria that are circulating in York. And I guess what I would say to you is remember that this plots by date of production. What I think is almost if you were to knock those 2 orange bits to fill the little gap in the right, a la Tetris, you might have a kind of accurate description of what's going on here. I think coinage from other parts of England is filling a currency gap in the 870s and 880s. Some of the reason I think that is this is the list of those coins. If we look at the detail of those, most of them date from the period kind of 840 to about 880 or so. They're mostly silver pennies of Wessex and Mercia, but with a few French and Danish coins in the mix as well. They're not from a single site, but are spread right across the townscape as well. When we compare these type of coins, when we compare these type of coins, they're quite different to what had gone before, copper alloy coins, but they do find enormous similarities to coins from the Great Army camps at Torksey and Aldwark. So if we look at Aldwark and Torksey occupied from the 870s and 872 to 3 respectively, then the types of coins that are being found in York at this moment in time are similar to those. And these coins would suggest to me that they're not being used and lost in the 850s and 860s, but they're coming with the Great Army and circulating in the 870s. And these coins would certainly show that there is a fundamental change in York's means of exchange, which likely coincides with the arrival of the Great Army. There was a move away from an exclusive local copper currency to a mixed one using silver coins from a range of different kingdoms. We can also see within York things that are familiar from those great army camps, the weighing out of precious metals. So we have these truncated spheroid weights in the top left here, and then a lead inset weight on the top right, and then a balance beam. And so these lead weights are lead and copper alloy and iron weights are used for the weighing out of bullion. You put your silver on one side and your bullion on the other. There are 3 of these weights from Coppergate. The one on the right here is from Clementhorpe, and there is good evidence for balance and scale pans from Coppergate as well. That said, this one slide is basically all of the evidence for the weighing out of precious metals, the hack silver economy that we have from York. And I think this is because it was only in use for a very short-lived period here. That gap in our coins that I've just looked at, 870s, 880s, could well be filled by this type of thing, but it doesn't seem to continue much later than that. I think that over time, that means of exchange starts as weighed silver like this, but very quickly is replaced by coins. And just to illustrate that comparison, we see fundamentally similar types of material culture in York to our reasonably well-dated Great Army camps at Old Walk and Torksey. If we then jump forward to the period after 870, we see far fewer coin finds in general, fewer dots on the map, less big circles. The only place where there are more than one coin find is right in the middle of this, which is at Coppergate, which has got evidence for metal working, craft activities. It's close to the later medieval market cross, and I don't really think there's any way of seeing it as anything other than the commercial heart of Viking Age York. But the bit I'm perhaps more interested in is the sort of relatively thin spread of coins right across the whole of that townscape. It's not all in one place, but the kind of brown smudge is the kind of best estimate that Historic Towns Atlas had for where the extent of Viking Age York extended to. And the coins slightly weirdly, neatly plot right to the edges of that. They're not all in one place. And it does suggest to me that there's a continued use of coinage across a range of spaces, purposes, and people. They're just not used with anything approximating the intensity of earlier periods. These are higher value silver coins used far less regularly. And I guess maybe the modern analogy is if you think of the difference between how you might use a 50p piece versus a £20 note, if you stop using your credit card for everything. But imagine 10 years ago when you were using cash, how often you might use a 50p piece versus that note. That's probably the analogy that's most helpful here. The other important thing to note is that there's a pretty effective exercise in control after 890. Only one coin that I've been able to identify is known to have been struck outside York in this time, that little orange blob around 900. And that contrasts to the period immediately before that. And this is a level of control over the means of exchange in York that is exerted both by the Scandinavian rulers and the southern English kings throughout the late 9th and 10th centuries. That Canute coinage that I talked about, struck in from its many hundreds of dies using tons of silver, doesn't result in a huge spike in number of finds, but it does result in pretty effective use of local currency. And I think it does effectively exclude other coin types from York. If you wanted to use the markets of Anglo-Scandinavian York, I think you had to use the appropriate coinage struck here in Anglo-Scandinavian York. You just don't get the coins of Wessex and Mercia that were found earlier. If you accept that suggestion, then it suggests 2 things. Firstly, that there was a fairly powerful elite capable of deciding that it wanted to control the means of exchange and strike a coinage. And secondly, that there was a fairly effective administration to back that desire up. And whilst the first coins struck in York feature secular rulers' names, Canute, Seaforth, and others, I think the effective administration of this coinage is likely to have been provided by the church in York. Archbishop Wulfhere had issued coins in his own right in the 850s and continued to rule as archbishop into the period where these coins were struck, likely turning a tidy profit in doing so. And all of the coinage of the late 9th and early 10th century features quite complex Christian iconography. On the coins of Canute, some of the earliest struck in York, your eyes have to make the sign of the cross to read them, C-N-U-T-R-E-X. That is not standard across anywhere else in England. This is really quite complicated. Alongside that, we have some other imagery. We have the hand of God in the top right, coinage that reads the money of St. Peter in the bottom right. And I think it's fairly indisputable that the church had a role in helping shape the iconography of these coins. And I think it likely, although harder to prove, that they also had a role in enforcing their use above other means of exchange in York. So then, just to try and summarize that kind of York case study, is that there's pretty widespread use of coinage before the Great Army arrives in York. Lots of coins changing hands many times. There was an exclusion of currency from beyond Northumbria until at least 850. There is an evidence for the economy like that found in the Great Army camps in the 870s, with mixed media, different types of silver, all circulating alongside one another, weights and coins of different types. From 890, coin use is spatially widespread in York, but not very intensive. Large numbers of coins were made, but don't translate into lots used and lost. And I think it just means there's a much less active means of exchange within the city. Nonetheless, this coinage was effectively excluded other coinages from use within the townscape. And I think there's likely a crucial role for the church in both the production of York's coinage and its administration. So then, the last of the three things to talk about today is the rest of the North. And I've assembled a data set that predominantly draws from the portable antiquity scheme, but enhanced with some coins from the corpus of early medieval coins. What I haven't done is all of the excavated coins across this period, because that's a Herculean task. And this is a similar chronological plot to what you get in York, time across the bottom, number of finds up the side here. And we see some fundamentally similar patterns. A very intense period of coin usage through until the 860s, with that spike in the 840s. A dramatic drop-off in coin use after the 860s, with really quite small numbers thereafter. And again, if we zoom in onto the right-hand side of this and just sort of blow this up, where we begin to see a divergence between York and the surrounding areas is with this graph. And again, blue representing coins struck in York, orange struck elsewhere. Where York's coins were almost inevitably made in the town at this period, that is not the picture for the rest of northern England. There remains a persistent minority of coinage that was made in York, but for quite a lot of the period here, there is more currency struck in other kingdoms circulating in the north than there was local official currency of southern Northumbria. If there was an enforcement of the use of local currency in York, this is not the case across the rest of the north. That's not connected to the availability of the coinages. You do find York coins sort of scattered across much of northern England, but I think more to do with the ability to enforce their use. There just isn't the administration to make this happen outside of York. If we look at this spatially, this is a map of coin finds through to about 870, and I've just looked at the stuff broadly from the kind of north of the Humber through to the Scottish border. Blue dots are coins made in York. The sparse orange dots are those from outside Northumbria, and the little orange triangles represent hoards. And I've just overlaid some rivers and Roman roads on this, so you can kind of get a sense of some of the routes through this landscape. I'm not going to tell you anything that you won't be able to read elsewhere, but the kind of the take-home message from this is that the area around York, which is the little red star here, is the southern part of Northumbria, is the area of particular intense coin use. You get east of the Pennines, south of the Moors is particularly where you get most coin finds, and that is not revolutionary. People have been writing about that for 30 years. John Naylor, Tony Abramson most recently. Here the distribution pattern mirrors that in York, where you get intensively and fairly widespread use of coinage in this area through till the arrival of the Great Army. After 870, we see a quite different set of patterns. So this is, again, same blue dots, York coins, orange dots struck elsewhere, and triangles representing your hoards. The focus of coin use and loss remains the southern part of Northumbria, Yorkshire now, but without the same intense concentration around York. And something different is happening west of the Pennines, and that's a different talk. And what I expected to see when I plotted this was there'd be a neat cluster, a halo of blue dots around York, representing the area of control of those striking in York. And I didn't get that, which is in some ways even more interesting. There is no clear patterning to it at all. There are a whole suite of coins that were not struck in York that are found in the vicinity of York, coins from elsewhere, particularly other parts of southern England. Then began to look at the hoards, which are the little triangles. And hoards are a slightly different thing. They provide a snapshot in time. We can date them to a particular time period, usually 5 years here or there. And they're often large amounts of silver or coins buried. And this is a selection of hoards. I haven't been through every hoard in Northern England in this time, looking at the kind of late 9th and 10th century. What these hoards demonstrate is that at no point across the north is locally struck coinage the dominant means of exchange. In all of these hoards, the greatest weight of silver is in the form of bullion. It's in ingots, it's in hack silver, it's in jewelry. That is the dominant means of exchange. Where there are coins, then the proportion of those coins that come from York are usually the minority, and often quite a small minority. They are outnumbered by coins that are being struck in other kingdoms within England. When viewed alongside the evidence from the finds on the map I showed you before, it suggests a few things to me. The first is regular, peaceable contact between northern and southern England. How else do so many southern English coins find their way into hoards in the north? And the second is perhaps more relevant today, is that there was no desire, or perhaps no ability, to enforce the use of Viking Northumbrian coinages outside of York, anywhere across the rest of northern England. So just to very briefly summarize that northern bit, is that we have a very intense use of coinage in the southern parts of Northumbria before the arrival of the Viking Great Army, close to York in particular. The intensity of use drops dramatically after 870, with that change from copper to silver currency. But the use remains focused on the area close to York, but it's not using York's currency. And there's no efforts, or perhaps no ability, to enforce the use of the official Northumbrian currency, even in areas very close to York. The Vale of York hoard, pictured here in the bottom and on display in the exhibition, found within 15 miles of York, only has just under 4% of the coins in it are actually struck in York. There are more coins struck for Alfred the Great, who ruled Wessex 50 years before this was buried, than there are of locally produced recent York coins. Now, so trying to draw all of this together then, how can we, how would you say? I guess inspired by the new research, has offered us a chance to reassess some well-analysed coinage today. I would say that Northumbria in the mid-9th century was a vibrant economy, producing coinage in huge numbers, in all likelihood millions, widely used within York and in the southern part of Northumbria in particular. This is likely to be one of the most intensively coin-using parts of northwestern Europe, used by more people for more types of transactions than anywhere else. The Great Army disrupted that. They brought quite different ways of doing business that are quite alien to what was seen in York and the north previously. They were hugely varied, with many types of means of exchange used simultaneously: silver, copper, gold weighed out, as well as whole silver coins from a range of kingdoms used. And these fundamentally altered the economy of York as well as the wider north. But in both of those scenarios, it can be argued that York and the north moved as one, they fundamentally following the similar patterns. But that changes around 890. In the latter years of the 9th and 10th century, there was an influx of silver, likely from the Islamic world. And this was probably originally in the form of bullion, ingots and jewelry, the type of things that were seen in the Bedale hoard. It then underpinned a huge expansion of the production of silver coins in York in the decade around AD 900 and again into the 10th century. And this was likely an attempt by the elite in York to profit from this influx of silver, creating a means of exchange that fundamentally they could tax. These new silver coins were much less intensively used than the copper coinage that they preceded them, likely used by fewer people for a more limited range of transactions higher up society. Those coins became the currency of the Viking Age York. And where evidence for continued use of hack silver or other coins, those coins became the currency of York, where the evidence for continued use of hack silver or coinages from other kingdoms is hard to find. However, across the rest of the north, hack silver continued to be used as probably the primary means of exchange, as did coinage from other kingdoms. This would suggest to me that York's ruling elites enforced the use of silver coinage only within the town. This extended to York, not beyond, in the late 9th and 10th centuries. Outside of this, there were few rules regarding the means of exchange. And their power was pretty geographically limited, I would suggest. And I think it's reasonable that it was perhaps the mechanism of the institutional church that facilitated that within York, but that power was limited beyond the boundaries of the town. So then, I guess I'll return to where I started. And I think Steve alluded to this as well, and say that I'm enormously grateful for the brilliant research of colleagues, which has prompted me to look again at this coinage. I think it absolutely highlights the value of interdisciplinary research, as what I've spoken about today was possible by functioning at the intersection of historical, archaeological, and archaeological science techniques. We're lucky to be able to share the rich outcomes of that collaboration with the public in our exhibition, Viking North. Thank you very much.